All right. So what I'm going to talk about today is based on my book that was published by Stanford University Press, like Roman said. And so I'm really grateful that I have this opportunity to give a talk for Stanford University's Hamid and Christina Moqaddam program in Iranian studies. And I would also like to thank Roman Parhad and Franco Errico for inviting me and organizing the event. So I will try to limit myself to about half an hour or so. I just want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. And to keep it brief, I decided not to just discuss the book chronologically or give some sort of chapter by chapter summary, but instead I'm going to give you a general sense of what the book attempts to do and what kind of questions it raises. So, to put it simply, Iranian Motion tells stories of sociocultural transformations in late Qajar and early Pahlavi Iran by studying how all sorts of ordinary people experienced a massive state-led infrastructural project. And to give brief background information, the Trans-Iranian Railway was the first long-haul railway in Iran constructed between 1927 and 1938. And although its construction process was supervised by a Danish consortium called CAMSAX, it was the mainstay of the centralization policies that the Pahlavi state of Iran pursued under Reza Shah. Um, so here is the map of the railway. And so the line from the Caspian Sea from Bandar Shah to the Persian Gulf, Bandar Shahpur. That is the Trans-Iranian Railway completed in 1938. And the lines that extend eastward and westward from Tehran are the ones that were constructed right after the Trans-Iranian Railway. So as you can see, this first railway connected two bodies of water in Iran. And it also went through important cities like Qom, right, the Shi'i shrine city in central Iran. It also went through the province of Lorestan, which is a pretty mountainous tribal region in western Iran, and also the major stations of Ahvaz or Bandar Shahpur. These are in the province of Khuzestan, which is a oil-producing region and bordering Iraq in the southwest. So the railway project touched the lives of many groups, right? From nomadic tribes, peasants, tourists, pilgrims, workers, technocrats, and whatnot. So given the diversity of the places the railway connected and the diversity of historical actors involved, I thought this railway project would be a great lens through which I could write interconnected social histories of early Pahlavi Iran. And to explain a little more precisely why I wrote this book, starting with this picture might be helpful. Some of you, especially you are from Iran, might be familiar with pictures like this, right? Pictures that prominently feature Reza Shah Pahlavi on the left and the Trans-Iranian Railway. The famous pictures like this include a picture of Reza Shah tightening the last bolt of the railway track when the construction was completed, while Reza Shah staring at a hand clock while waiting for the departure of a train to make sure, the trains are running on time. So these are some interesting examples of pictures from the period. And also you might be familiar with pictures like this one, right? Pictures that feature the magnificence of the material structure itself. These pictures appeared really frequently in the Iranian press of the time period, which was heavily censored. And they were accompanied by captions that gave technological factoids about the length of the railway or the number of bridges, tunnels, the amount of cement used for construction, and also, as you might expect, there was always this praise to Reza Shah's willpower for making the railway the national dream of Iran come true. So this sort of industrial photography is it's not necessarily unique to Iran, especially in the interwar period, right? Contemporary states across the world showcased their technological achievements for legitimacy through infrastructure, including, notable examples like Germany's Autobahn. And in the case of early Pahlavi Iran, massive material structures like railway stations, bridges, and tunnels evoked a sense of awe and wonder. And coupled with the repeated claim that it was Reza Shah who made it happen in Iran, pictures like this essentially legitimized Pahlavi rule. So along with visual evidence represented in photography, like this bridge, um, the captions provided techno-scientific data to sort of create an aura of objectivity. And by doing so, these articles in the Iranian press presented the successful operations of the railway and the subsequent transformations of the nation as a fait accompli. Okay, so I think I can stop sharing because I don't have that many images from now. Um, So I wrote my book in the way I did because I felt like both popular perceptions, especially Iranian popular perceptions, and professional historians' interpretations of the Trans-Iranian Railway accepted the fundamental premises of this sort of state propaganda. And they've done so mainly by reproducing the views expressed in official publications. Right. So in most accounts of history, the Trans-Iranian Railway is discussed in the context of political and economic integration of the early Pahlavi period, and especially emphasizing the actions of Reza Shah himself. And it's also, and on the other hand, it pays very little attention to many other aspects of the railway project. So I was really, at the beginning of this project, I was curious about just finding out some basic aspects of the railway that existing scholarship didn't really address. Like, so who were the workers that built the railway? Or how were those workers organized, and in what kind of conditions did they live? Or who traveled by train, and what was it like to travel by train at the time? And more importantly, who operated the railway system and how did that railway system work? So asking questions like these meant, thinking about a lot of mundane issues. So for example, what did it mean to operate steam locomotives, which would require a lot of water in an arid country like Iran? Or more broadly, like what environmental impacts did the railway have? How did railway regulations develop, given that there was a very popular perception that accidents were so frequent with the Trans-Iranian Railway. So my research process started with exploring all these little questions and putting them together later to think through what they meant. And I actually ended up writing an entire chapter on the quest for producing a safe and speedy movement by preventing accidents, especially after the completion of the railway in 1938. And this fact that accident prevention measures developed mostly after 1938, and especially during the 1940s, illustrates how the railway system didn't start functioning simply because the material structure like stations and bridges existed, right? It also shows how so much of the railway system was not completed in the Reza Shah period, but there were significant developments during the crucial years of the Allied occupation and its aftermath. Um, and I think this is an important point because accounts that focus on Reza Shah's actions give the impression that technology was sort of unproblematically transferred from Europe to Iran, and then that process ended with the completion of the railway in 1938. But stories of how Iranian technocrats, workers, and travelers all engaged with questions like how to operate the railway or how to use it. These questions continued to evolve after 1938. Um, but I'm I'm not really saying that focusing on political and economic integration is inherently problematic, right? Because the early Pahlavi period did witness rapid expansion of state power. But an almost exclusive attention to Reza Shah and his state didn't quite sit well with how many of my Iranian colleagues, friends talked about the railway by giving me vivid individual accounts of how their fathers or grandfathers um, uh, worked for the railway in its early decades, like 1920s and 30s. And it certainly didn't convey the complexities that I kept finding in travelogues or memoirs written by railway travelers and workers. And to me, it seemed like not integrating these accounts and privileging only official accounts would perpetuate the misconception that the state was the engine for change that operated separately from society, which kind of passively received or reacted to Pahlavi modernization efforts. Um, okay, so with this framework, my book argues that the notion, or my book sort of argues against the notion that the railway project was a linear process of national integration and homogenization with Tehran as its uncontested center. And instead, the Trans-Iranian Railway unevenly redistributed mobilities. And in doing so, it connected multiple geographies and groups provincially, nationally, and even transnationally. So in the book, I sort of address a lot of issues related to the transnational origins and consequences of this railway project. I also pay attention to how the railway did not just connect geographies, right? It also severed pre-existing connections on the multiple spatial scales, which resulted in the redirection of mobilities. And I ultimately show how these processes of redistributing mobilities produced Iranians who were differentiated by their practices of mobility. So mobility was really key to how people defined themselves. Um, and I should probably talk a little more about what I mean by mobility and why it's important in the book. So historians usually use the concept of mobility in a macro spatial sense, right? So mobility is often equated with travel and migration. And I do use mobility in this sense too, but I also use it to discuss more qualitative aspects of movement, meaning how individuals experience travel and migration as they make more micromotions, right? To put it in a little more concrete way, let me talk about pilgrim mobility as an example. Um, the early Pahlavi state promoted tourist mobility, or the vacation of citizens to Iran's historical and natural sites to strengthen their attachment to the nation. Right? So Tehrani middle classes summer trips to places like Mazandaran would be a quintessential form of tourist mobility. While promoting this kind of exercise of mobility, the early Pahlavi official discourse viewed pilgrim mobility with more suspicion, particularly transnational pilgrimage to Mecca and Shi'i holy cities like Najaf and Karbala. Right? This was the case because pilgrim mobility was often seen as potentially subversive for the nation by creating competing focal points of citizens' loyalty that went beyond national boundaries. Um, and in addition to the destination and purpose of travel, there are other reasons why pilgrim mobility was problematic. And it was associated with pilgrims' sort of appearance and behavior, right? Their appearance in religious garments in public spaces of the railway, and also with perceptions of their disorderly behavior in public, like how they would push each other to get on the train and spread sofre on the floor to have meals on the train. And this kind of debates were really frequent in all sorts of Iranian publications, newspapers, journals in the Pahlavi period. And the travel writing of the period also, which are usually left by people with urban professional backgrounds, they often made comments about different behavioral codes that divided travelers among categories like class and national belonging. So mobility is very much socially differentiated by who exercises it for what purpose, in what manner, and to where, and so forth. And it's even differentiated by the question of who gets to move at all, right? Because some people encountered various forms of obstacles in exercising their mobilities. Um, and the set of questions I just asked, like who gets to move, for what purposes, and to where, and so forth, these are asked again and again by both advocates of different versions of a Trans-Iranian Railway and their critics. So, for example, among political leaders of the early Pahlavi state, mobility was really a double-edged sword because mobility was necessary to move troops from Tehran to the provinces to control autonomous centers of power that were active at the beginning of the Pahlavi period in the 1920s. And mobility was also necessary to produce a national economy because the idea of a national economy was predicated on the assumption of smooth flow of goods across the nation. And equally importantly, mobility was a crucial precondition for the propagation of what official discourse called the new civilization, or Tamaddun Jadid, which was essentially a way of living based on a imagined European modernity. So the official discourse expected urban middle-class Iranians with professional backgrounds or skilled railway workers with proper education and their family members to travel to the provinces, or even live in those provinces, then inculcate modern ways of life and a sense of national identity to the excuse me, to the quote unquote backward country folks. So this is why promoting national tourism was an important part of the Pahlavi state project, so that they would function as sort of like missionaries of the new civilization, ideals throughout the country. So to produce a politically, economically, and culturally coherent national space, the Pahlavi state needed to facilitate the movement of people, goods, and ideas, especially from the capital to the provinces. So again, who moves for what purposes to where, all of these issues are really central. But at the same time, state propaganda of the time expressed deep anxiety about unregulated mobility. In addition to pilgrim mobility I mentioned earlier, tribal mobility was a prime example, because many borderland tribes had familiar ties that transcended porous national borders and moved across them frequently. They're also seen as too unreliable to be long-term laborers, because at the beginning of the Pahlavi period, they tended to work only sort of temporarily for a short period for infrastructure construction and maintenance projects. And especially pastoral nomads would move seasonally. So this sort of a frequent movement made them really unreliable, uh, for the productivity of construction and maintenance. So infrastructural projects like the Trans-Iranian Railway were expected to transform these tribes into permanent laborers or industrial workers. And similarly, workers' transnational migration raised suspicion from the Pahlavi state. So again, this is another example of a kind of a threatening unregulated mobility. So we should keep in mind that the construction and operation of the Trans-Iranian Railway generated massive waves of transnational migration especially because Iran didn't have enough skilled workers needed for constructing the railway. But the problem was that their cross-border movement could accompany the circulation of ideas like communism, labor activism, and other potentially subversive ideas, right? And there were indeed numerous railway workers who did take advantage of their rail mobility. So they took the train to connect with comrades across national boundaries, especially once we get into the 1940s. So in a sense, the Trans-Iranian Railway became a corridor that linked, say, communists or labor activists of the Soviet Union to the Persian Gulf region. Um, so as we can see in these examples, the railway project wasn't even intended to produce mobilities evenly for everybody. While promoting more national scale movement of certain kinds, the Pahlavi state tried to regulate and transform other types of threatening mobility, the kind of mobility that didn't necessarily conform to the logic of the nation in terms of the spatial scale of the movement or the purpose of the movement, and the way in which the movement was performed. So the railway project was purported to fundamentally transform mobility so that the Iranian nation would embody the ideals of the new civilization through the bodies of its citizens. But of course, it would be impossible to sort of mold individuals into these idealized prototypes. So the gap between these ideals and uh, maybe what we can call reality, led to a constant tension between the logic of the nation, mainly expressed in the censored Iranian press, and various everyday practices of mobility among, a broad segment of society. And I should also note that conversations existed among these ordinary people's practices of mobility. So for example, I discuss how railway workers had to compete with each other for the dwindling resources of the railway organization in the post-occupation period during the mid to late 1940s. The context of the post-occupation period is really important here because the railway organization expanded drastically during the Allied occupation when the Trans-Iranian Railway was used as a crucial route to transport Lend-Lease materials from the Persian Gulf to the Soviet Union. And the number of the organization's employees increased from roughly 8,000 to 36,000, making it Iran's second largest company at the time, surpassed only by the Anglo-Iranian oil company. But once the occupation was over, the demands for rail traffic dropped. And to make matters even worse, the late 1940s was the period when intercity bus service developed substantially in Iran, and the railway became less and less competitive for passenger traffic. So in response, the railway organization began waves of massive layoffs, which was a major betrayal from the workers' perspective, because during the war, they had been told that they would have to persevere and contribute to the Allied victory so that they would be rewarded once the war was over. And once the war was over, the promise was not fulfilled. And in this context, I analyze how railway workers integrated stories of mobility in their self-narration of life, which appeared frequently in the railway organization's newspapers. Um, and in these accounts of workers' life stories, they often valorized national scale migration as the most worthy sacrifice for the nation because they had to live away from the family of moving to scorching the southern province of Khuzestan from much colder regions in the north. And they had to survive on rationed bread, contaminated with sand and pebbles. So workers shared these stories to prove their worthiness in comparison with other workers whose sacrifices were presumably less profound. So the argument was like because other workers sacrificed less, they shouldn't receive the same kind of perquisites or compensations from the railway organization. So workers from the north who had to live in Khuzestan argued things like, well, Khuzestani workers should receive less perks and compensations because the hot and humid climate of Khuzestan shouldn't be a problem for them. And they didn't even live that far from their families. And Iranian workers argued that non-Iranian workers like Indians and Iraqis shouldn't qualify for perks because they don't really belong in the nation in the first place. So we see the emergence of the Iranian national railway workforce by the late 1940s, but that emerging national workforce was deeply divided, not just based on rank and skill sets, but also based on the spatial scale of the mobility they performed. And another example uh, of how contestations among ordinary people's practices of mobility um, was important that comes from railway travelers. It's sort of similar to how railway workers did, but travelers also differentiated each other based on the spatial and qualitative aspects of mobility in the context of the Allied occupation. So despite the emphasis on national tourism in official discourse, what emerged in the late 40s or in the 1940s was it was this railway space, which included places like train compartments and station platforms, this kind of railway space that was occupied by all sorts of people, from pilgrims going to Rome or other shrine cities outside Iran, like Najaf and Karbala. There are a lot of beggars, pickpockets, and then there are also many allied soldiers and even prostitutes who catered to those soldiers, right? And all of these groups shared the same space. And these diverse occupants of the railway space didn't really have the same access to mobility. So to give you an example, the fourth class cars that pilgrims often used were essentially freight cars without light, without seats, and without ventilation. So they used these cars partly because of affordability, but a more structural issue was the prioritization of wartime needs of the Allies during the occupation, which made regular passenger cars unavailable to many Iranian civilians. Um, and so to ventilate and avoid excessive heat in these freight cars, passengers often left the doors open as as the train traveled. And you can imagine the danger of leaving the doors open on crowded freight cars, especially considering the mountainous terrains that the Trans-Iranian Railway ran through in mountainous regions like Lorestan. So whenever accidents happened, victims among the passengers came disproportionately from Iranian pilgrims in fourth class cars. So especially in the context of the occupation, even the safety of movement was hierarchically, even the safety of movement was organized hierarchically. So in both cases of workers and travelers, the main thing we see is the processes of producing Iranians as citizens who were very much differentiated by the kind of mobilities they had access to and how they practiced it. And the book studies these contestations from the period of the infrastructural expansion in Iran's neighboring empires during the 1860s all the way to the late 1940s, right before the beginning of the oil nationalization movement. Um, Okay, so before I finish, I just want to come back to my temporal and spatial frameworks, because not seeing the railway project exclusively as Reza Shah's railway opened the door for me to reevaluate sort of the temporal spatial frameworks I had in mind at the beginning of this project when I was a PhD student. So a big chunk of my book is about the 1940s. after Reza Shah was forced to abdicate by the Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941, which I find really interesting because when I began to work on this project, I thought I was going to write primarily about the Reza Shah period. And I ended up discussing the 40s a lot because as much as the Trans-Iranian Railway evolved in the Reza Shah period, it was also a product of the Allied occupation of Iran and its aftermath, right? So in many ways, the railway project acquired a path of its own after 1941 and shaped Iran's sociocultural transformations in ways that were unforeseen by its planners. And the rapid expansion of social welfare programs, right, in the aftermath of the occupation among railway workers, or the spatial segregation of railway passengers, um, especially between Iranian civilians and the Allied soldiers, these are good examples of how things continue to evolve after 1941, the abdication of Reza Shah. And I mean, more obviously, the fact that the transport capacity of the railway increased by almost 20 times during the occupation to respond to the new demand to transport the Lend-Lease materials to the Soviet Union, it illustrates the importance of the occupation and its aftermath, right? There's a massive circulation of people, goods, and ideas that came with the rapid expansion of transport infrastructure networks, um, which had to be built by a lot of migrant workers who often crossed borders from places like Iraq, Kuwait, into Iran. So my point is that social and cultural historians of Iran could, look at these contingent processes that unfolded during this crucial decade to get a better sense of a kind of a more longer term consequences of the reform projects from the Reza Shah period. And in terms of my spatial framework, as I've been talking about so far, I pay so much attention to the railway project's transnational origins and consequences. Um, Now, once I began to follow mobile individuals instead of official proclamations, I realized that the lack of attention to transnational connections was perhaps one of the most serious byproducts of viewing the railway as Reza Shah's national project, right? So, for example, the first generation of railway workers, it's usually associated with the establishment of technical schools by the Pahlavi state in the late 1930s. But the Trans-Iranian Railway was undertaken over 60 years after the rapid expansion of rail and steamship networks in Iran's neighboring regions like India, the Caucasus, and the Ottoman Empire. So this means that the railway project necessarily interacted with existing infrastructural networks and with existing circulation of labor produced by them, right? So there are a lot of skilled laborers who had been working on infrastructural projects outside Iran before the Trans-Iranian Railway project started. And so many of the early railway workers had acquired industrial experience in Iran's neighboring empires. And one of the things I do in the book is to use a series of workers' interviews published in the railway industry's newspapers to show how first generation workers were part of two distinct transnational circulations of labor, one of which involved the circulation of labor in the Caucasus, Russia, and Anatolia. And particularly, Azaris worked in construction in the industrial sectors in this transborder region in the first few decades of the 20th century, and many of them came back to Iran in the late 20s and early 30s when the construction of the Trans-Iranian Railway began. Um, and the other circuit centered around the Persian Gulf. This included the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, where many Khuzistanis acquired their first industrial experience before joining the railway industry in the 1930s and 40s. But there are also many Iraqis and Indians, especially Sikhs and Parsis, who came to Iran as the first generation of locomotive engineers. So while it is true that technical schools from the Reza Shah period produced thousands of new workers by the late 40s, they were preceded by both Iranian and non-Iranian workers who had migrated across borders before the rise of the Pahlavi state in 1925. And I wanted to think about these connections because too often we think of histories of infrastructures or history of technologies in the non-West by thinking about the West as the origin of technological expertise and the non-Western place we study as the receiving end of that expertise that tries to sort of negotiate with or sort of acculturate or Western knowledge, right? But this sort of sometimes it has the effect of reducing the relationship to just the West and the specific place we study in the non-West. But to understand this case of the Trans-Iranian Railway, we had to think about it, how the Trans-Iranian Railway project took place in interacting with many regional uh, uh, circulation routes of labor or ideas. So this was a sort of a brief overview of what my book attempts to do and what kind of questions I wanted to address. And I would look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was very interesting. Maybe a first question from our audience. They write, I was wondering if the main reason for having the railway was to have modernization. Was it better to have the railway run from the northwest, like Tabriz to Tehran, shorter and cheaper, and also turn around and avoid religious cities like Qom?
So there are many different ideas of what route the railway should take. And when this route from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf was decided, one of the major arguments was cost. Other routes proposed, including routes that connected, entering from Tabriz, connecting with the Russian railway system to Tabriz and connecting it to Tehran and exiting Iran from southeastern part, so Balochistan. That was another major route proposed, but it was just too costly. And the places after Tehran was considered too sparsely populated to make sense. So if the sure, the purpose of was modernization, but it was also nationalization, right? I mean, sort of responding to this question was about whether it was about modernization, right, Roma?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So modernization didn't necessarily, it was about modernization, but also nationalization. So avoiding Qom, I mean, Qom was not initially talked about as a major route because when in the 1920s, people started to talk about potential routes for the railway, they're thinking about maybe Qazvin, which is a kind of a more obvious choice because Qazvin was the historical sort of nodal point that connected northern Iran and southern Iran, right? And whenever people leave Tehran, they would go to Qazvin first. But for again, for the reasons of cost, Qazvin was avoided, but because if you once you go to Qazvin and try to go south to the Persian Gulf, which was the major way for Iran to connect to the global economy, you have to go through the mountainous regions like Hamadan, Kermanshah, and that was just too costly, right? So there are always these discussions of cost, but I'm sorry, I'm sort of talking about all sorts of issues. So cost was always a really important issue, but I just want to talk about Qom because uh, Qom was not quite avoided so once it was decided that Qom would be part of the railway route, almost, if anything, it was kind of promoted. The railway company ran special trains, weekend trains to Qom for pilgrimage passengers. And we might think it's kind of a weird if we think about the Pahlavi state trying to sort of emphasize the sort of a quote unquote secular modernity. But Qom was a much better alternative to people going to, say, uh, Najaf or Karbala, both for, sort of redirecting the pilgrimage traffic within Iranian sacred cities, but also for Iranians too. I mean, people go to pilgrimage, and Qom was just so close from Tehran, right? So almost not necessarily sort of avoided. It's so this time period of the 1930s, 40s, it's the sort of the rise of Qom, both because of the change within the Qom seminary, but also because of the sort of infrastructural shift that made Qom a much accessible national center of pilgrimage.
Great, thank you. Another viewer writes, thank you so much for your presentation and your magnificent book. I have two questions, so we'll start with the first one. How did the narrative of the Victory Bridge align with the Iranian nationalist discourse, despite the Anglo-Soviet invasion representing a moment of national defeat rather than triumph? And were there instances where nationalist figures, particularly those critical of the Trans-Iranian Railway project like Mohammad Mossadegh, accused railway workers of being complicit or compromised in their relationship with the occupying forces?
Um, okay, so the railway project, I'm answering from the second part of the question. So when the railway project started in the 1920s, there were already some oppositions, right? Small, yet major figures like Mossadegh questioned the validity of the railway project. But the way he expressed it in the 1920s and 30s was mostly related to uh, sort of the economic uh, rationale for building a railway. Um, so it's more about why would you build a railway in the age of automobilization? I talked about the example of other infrastructure projects like the Autobahn in Germany. I mean, a lot of countries are moving toward building highways, but yet the Pahlavi state decided to build a railway, and that was partly because of this sort of a deeply ingrained dream of having this thing called the railway that all other countries have. So railway really symbolized technological modernity in early Pahlavi Iran. Um, I can sort of keep going on and on about various oppositions to the railway project and why it was problematic for so many people, both because of the routes and economic impact, cultural impact. But I want to sort of yeah, I can come back to it if time allows, but I want to come back to the other question, which was about how does this narrative of the Victory Bridge can coexist with the fact that it happened because of the Allied occupation. Was that?
Yes. So
Okay.
the first part of that question was, how did the narrative of the Victory Bridge align with Iranian nationalist discourse, despite the Anglo-Soviet invasion representing a moment of national defeat rather than triumph?
Yeah. So, I mean, the discourse of this Victory Bridge, and by the way, uh, at the time in the 1940s, when people talked about the Victory Bridge, they were talking about the entire Trans-Iranian Railway. Today, sometimes people talk about the Victory Bridge as specifically to talk about Poleveresk, which is in northern Iran. But at the time, it was the Victory Bridge was the entire railway route, and as well as the highway that connected from Tehran through Qazvin to the Caspian Sea. Um, and this the notion that this route connecting the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf was represented at Victory Bridge started to be sort of promoted by in the official discourse as well as by the Iranian Railway Organization by the towards the end of the occupation to sort of celebrate, I guess, to sort of increase the morale of workers in some ways, but also as a way to sort of celebrate this legacy that the railway organization had in bringing the Allies' victory. But there are also, this is again the official discourse. There are a lot of sort of dissenting voices to it, right? One clear example might be, I mean, politically, there are a lot of pro-German railway engineers and workers who experienced purges and arrests throughout the occupation. But also, a lot of workers questioned this notion of the victory bridge because in the official discourse, it's sort of it's a way to increase the morale by talking about, well, we have to, again, like I said earlier in the talk, we have to persevere. Once we achieve this victory, we will have better life. But workers were sort of already complaining in the 1930, before the end of the occupation by 1943, 44. I mean, there's so much inflation, their salaries not raising. So they were complaining about this notion of victory bridge very harshly. They weren't necessarily talking about, at least in newspapers, and they weren't necessarily talking about how the notion of the victory bridge can coexist with the fact of the Allied occupation. That doesn't quite appear in various official pronouncements. But at the same time, so they don't quite connect these dots explicitly, but that doesn't mean there are strong reactions to the presence of the Allied soldiers throughout in the first half of the 1940s. So you see a lot of accounts left by railway workers who are complaining about the bossiness of Allied soldiers, racism, or the behavior of these Allied soldiers. I mentioned the presence of prostitutes in the railways, and that was one of the contentious issues, the notion that our women are being, taken by Allied soldiers. That was all, so all of these dissatisfactions with the Allied presence were expressed, but not so this connection between the Victory Bridge and the Allied occupation were more expressed in an implicit manner than explicit.
Thank you. Another viewer writes, thank you for your efforts. I would like to know about the inflation caused by this project and the financial sources of this project. In part of your book, you brought the propaganda around this project, and I would like to know the real economic impact and the part which gets hidden like inflation or that wasn't discussed in the realm of impacts.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I have to confess I'm not an economic historian, and pretty early on in the project, I decided not to sort of get into this discussion of, because there are other economists who are much more interested in was this railway project a sensible decision? What's the cost analysis in relation to developing highways? So these analyses are done by other people, and I don't really get into that question. But the one thing that we should think about is the construction was financed. Whoever grew up in Iran is aware of this sort of a celebration of, well, it's the tea and sugar consumption taxes and these things, right, through state monopoly that funded the railway construction project. And that's partly true, but also there is a lot of budget drawn from bank loans. So it's not necessarily funded just by tea and sugar taxes. There are various other forms of national loans that would put more pressure on the future generations. And what's really interesting is that these aspects were really talked about in the sort of official proclamations of the early Pahlavi period for very obvious reasons, right? You want to sort of emphasize that we are building it through your sacrifices, you're paying for it.
Thank you. Another viewer writes, although we like to attribute many feats to Reza Shah, beyond his leadership, who were some of the other Iranian figures involved in the decision to create the railway, either government officials or businessmen or both?
Um, well, what I was trying to emphasize in the talk is I don't want to sort of see it as sort of Reza Shah's leadership in that built the railway. That's sort of the popular perception, which creates all sorts of methodological problems that I wanted to lay out, sort of from the sort of a decoupled view from the pre-Pahlavi origins of the railway debates to the post Reza Shah consequences of the railway project. So I'm not trying to sort of so this is another thing I wanted to stay away from, which is like sort of a great man history of this railway project. Sure, there were major figures that are discussed very frequently from, well, um, I can't sort of think of specific names of engineers right now, but there are always sort of a few engineers who became the major technocrats in the railway organization in the late 40s. But I was much more interested in like what it really meant for various people who are never talked about.
Thank you. Was there any historical point at which the Soviets opposed or attempted to intervene directly in the Trans-Iranian Railway or favored an alternative route, especially considering their interventions in Iran's internal affairs and the fact that the railway, as your book notes, connected Mazandaran and Khorasan market more to the south than to the Soviet territories in the north?
Um, so what I found out as I studied this project is that before that beginning of the project in 1927, there were various projects proposed by both the British, Russians, and other powers. And they never had any singular views of what the railway routes should look like, right? So there are so many disagreements within British institutions and individuals, and the same goes for Russians. Some advocated for connecting Iran through Tabriz and connecting it all the way to Balochistan. And others are saying, well, no, we don't want railways because not having infrastructure is good for Russian commercial dominance in northern Iran. So, I mean, there were multiple different viewpoints on this. And they did try to sort of push for specific policies. One consequence of which was the embargo on railway construction that Nasruddin Shah struck with the Russians in the late 19th century, which is part of the reason there was no major construction until the beginning of World War One. But
Thank you. Another person writes, thank you very much for the thought-provoking talk. Setting aside the Pahlavi state's official narrative of the railway project as a tool for national integration, to what extent did the project shape popular perceptions of Iran as a unified body and reinforce the idea of Iran as the homeland of all Iranians from the perspective of the broader population?
um, I think it depends on what time period we think about, because obviously if we go to Iran today, the Trans-Iranian Railway is, there's a massive this enthusiasm and maybe nostalgia for Pahlavi technological modernity. So in that sense, it's very much connected to, the Trans-Iranian Railway today is very much connected to how many Iranians think about this uh, uh, possibility for uh, the present and the future that is different from the current situation. But if we think about the time period I'm talking about in the book, like the 1940s and 30s and 40s, we should keep in mind that the railway went through a very specific part of the country. If you think about it, the only major city in Iran that had the railway was Tehran, right? Tabriz, Mashhad, Isfahan, Shiraz, all of these cities weren't part of the railway project, and they were very much in opposition to uh, not necessarily the railway project in principle, but bypassing their cities. Um, so for these people, the railway project was not quite a sort of symbol of kind of a Iran as a single nation, but if anything, it was about the railway project was very much plagued by provincialism, right? If it doesn't come to our area, why would we have to pay through taxation on tea and sugar? So that was the more common response than sort of a envisioning a single unified nation through the railway project. And even among the people who traveled on trains, what they witnessed was like how most people didn't have a national identity. It's still the mid 1940s, and most people didn't receive sort of elementary education, middle school education that inculcated national values on them. So once Tehrani middle class travelers go to places like Khuzestan, they encounter that, why are you talking in that funny accent? And you they would say, ask questions like, so are you a northerner? I'm Desvili. I'm you know Ahwazi. So there's a very strong local sense of belonging, with which was not really superseded by national identity in this time period.
Thank you. Are there historic differences between nomadic mobility and sedentary citizens' mobility?
Historic differences between nomadic mobility and sedentary citizens mobility. Um, I'm not exactly sure the precise meaning of the question, but I could say that that nomadic mobility was considered as much more problematic for in the context of the railway construction project. Because again, the idea was to sort of transform all these tribal groups into productive industrial laborers, right? And the sedentary groups are much easier to control in that sense. Um, and they didn't necessarily have direct, they as in local governors or the concessionaires that undertook the infrastructural projects. They didn't necessarily control these people, tribal groups directly, but they control these individuals through tribal khans, right? And for nomadic tribes, just the simple fact of their frequent movement and their tendency to sort of get paid on the spot and not come back next week was much more difficult than how sedentary peasants uh, were controlled by these construction projects, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Just in the nature of time, maybe I'll ask you two last questions and you can pick which one you'd like to focus.
Okay.
What was the railroad's impact on women's mobility specifically? Or if you'd like to say more about the environmental impact of building the railroad.
Oh, it's hard to choose. Um, So since I was talking about prostitutes earlier, I wanted to talk a little more about these prostitutes. What's really interesting is that, um, well, not exclusively prostitutes, but women's mobility did raise massive anxiety, as you might expect, right? It's also coinciding with various Pahlavi policies like caste hijab. So there are unveiled women walking around. Um, and on top of that, after the Allied occupation, there are foreigners in the train who were, the occupiers in Iran. So there was this increasing fear that women might be uh, selling sex to Allied soldiers in closed train compartments, right? Because again, it kind of speaks to the nature of this railway space, which is sort of public, but at the same time, there are all sorts of uh, closed spaces in which all sorts of things could happen. Um, um, but despite these nationalist anxieties, what seems clear is that a lot of sex workers of the 1940s continued to occupy various places of the railway space, not just compartments. I found this really interesting account of how other sex workers sort of jumped off the train in the middle of the desert in Khuzestan, and they sort of camp there, wait for their customers there, who are usually Allied soldiers. And it's kind of a shared knowledge between Allied soldiers and these sex workers. And then they eventually the police tries to crack down on them. But I mean, to what extent can you just keep chasing these locations for meetups that keep popping up along the railway routes in the middle of nowhere, right? So the railway, I'm talking about a very specific group of women, but it created this movement of all sorts of women, right? Again, if it's sort of a tourist women going to Mazandaran, that's great. But if you start talking about these undesirable figures moving around, it immediately generates anxiety, which sort of goes back to the issue of how mobilities were really unevenly produced and redistributed.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Koyagi.
Thank
Congratulations
you
on
so much.
the book, Iran in Motion, published by Stanford University Press. There's a link in chat to learn more. We look forward to your future research and hopefully having you back at Stanford. Thank you for joining us on Zoom.
Thank you so much for having me.